What does it mean to be native or indigenous? Are the English native to South America? Are the Dutch native to Africa? The answer to these questions may surprise you. This is a topic that has certainly stirred up a lot of controversy and debate throughout the world as different groups of people argue who was where first, but this is a rather myopic viewpoint considering that technically no humans are native anywhere, considering every single group came from somewhere else and somewhere else when you look back far enough in their ancestry, and intermixing throughout the ages has significantly complicated the matters as well. For instance, the hominid species of Neanderthal and Denisovan are believed to have split from the ancestors of Homo sapiens some hundreds of thousands of years ago, inhabiting much of the Eurasian landmass during this time. So really, humans are the invaders, and these are the rightful natives of the entire supercontinent. However, ancient humans did indeed interbreed with both of these ancient species to varying levels, so did we de facto become the natives since their DNA is in us? Not to mention, there were other hominids living in Eurasia even before the Neanderthal and Denisovans arrived, mainly other descendants of Homo erectus, and it's possible that Denisovan may have actually interbred with one or more of these archaic species before modern humans arrived. So technically, when you look at the ancestry of someone with Denisovan DNA, no matter how minute, they could technically trace back continuous habitation of their region of the earth for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. The point is, native and indigenous are rather arbitrary terms that we use simply for convenience sake in order to simplify a much more complex and nuanced topic than most care to learn of. And I understand that factual information on these topics are important, but the whole game of who was where first is sometimes simply a measure of semantics. For instance, there are both European and African descendants who claim that the indigenous peoples of the Americas actually came from their continent, and they're technically the true natives of the Americas, usually quite a politically biased position, and neither of these proposals have any weight to them in my opinion, especially when considering that the Americas have actually been found to have been inhabited much further in the past than previously thought, updating from what archaeologists originally thought was 10,000 years ago in the past to 13,000, 16,000, and now it's considered possible it may have even been 20,000 years ago. However, one thing that still confounds historians to this day is traces of Australoid admixture found in low, albeit statistically significant amounts in some isolated tribes from throughout South America, especially in the Amazon rainforest, and possibly even in the Yagcan inhabitants of Tierra del Fuego, who similarly are descended from some of the earliest migrants ever to enter into the Americas. This is believed to be traces of some of the original waves of migration of ancient Proto-Amerindians from Siberia who may have carried some Australo-Melanesian DNA from Southeast. And it's even been surmised by some, such as writer Graham Hancock, that the Olmec civilization of Central America, one of the oldest in the region, may have been descended from these original Proto-Amerindians with significant Australoid ancestry due to the unusual appearance of some of their stone busts before future migrations washed over them. So are the Mayans or Aztecs really indigenous to Central America, since they likely displaced the previously existing population that may have been completely alien to them? Although unsubstantiated, this goes to show how difficult it is to discern the indigenous inhabitants of a given area, as in this regard, everything is more or less relative. However, there are some cases where initial human habitation is not only indisputable, but also well documented and backed by solid evidence, and hence we'll be defining human nativity as the first group of modern humans to create permanent settlements on an isolated landmass. Now that we've got a clear and solid definition to work with, we can look at some of the most bizarre cases of indigenous inhabitants from around the globe. Now, we discussed in the last video how the original peoples of Southeast Asia and Oceania were the dark-skinned Australoids, consisting of Papuans and Aboriginals, and in the case of the Negritos only being a small minority confined to the mountainous interiors of certain lands, such as Luzon or Peninsular Malaysia. But one interesting fact is that the ancient Proto-Australoids actually never made it to some of the islands before the Austronesians of East Asian descent showed up. Although Papuan tribes had made it to and inhabited the Solomon Islands and others in this archipelago, such as New Britain, New Ireland, and Bougainville thousands of years ago, some more remote islands such as Vanuatu, Fiji, and New Caledonia were left completely untouched by humans in all of history until the arrival of the Polynesians some 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. The Polynesians who settled on these islands became known as the Lapita culture and existed until around 500 BC, when large numbers of Papuans from the aforementioned islands, spurred on by this new knowledge, proceeded to migrate south into this new territory, and whether this was a peaceful expansion or violent conquest is unknown. Geneticists have actually been able to document how the genetics of Fijians, New Caledonians, and Vanuatuans quickly shifted from predominantly East Asian, like other Polynesians, to predominantly Australoid, like the Papuans, but for whatever reason, they took on their own Austronesian languages, which is why linguistically the Melanesians are related to the Polynesians, but genetically they are far closer to those from Papua New Guinea. Another case of a native people group being expelled or dominated in their own land is the Faroe Islands and Iceland, both located rather far out in the Atlantic Ocean, and regions you might recognize as being a part of the Norse or Scandinavian cultural realm today. However, it's actually been found that before the Norse Vikings arrived and settled these islands, both were actually already inhabited by Celtic peoples from the British Isles, and hence technically one could say that the Celts are native to Iceland and the Faroes. Interestingly, the people in these islands do still have Celtic ancestry though, since later on many Celtic men and women were kidnapped by the Vikings and were brought to these islands as slaves and war brides, and hence they are a combination of Norse and Celtic ancestry, although their culture is predominantly derived from the Scandinavians. There are other interesting examples of first human habitation on islands in the vicinity of Europe that one wouldn't expect, with the Norwegian island of Svalbard in the far north in the Arctic Circle originally being discovered and inhabited by the Dutch in the early 17th century in a settlement known as Smeerenburg, and British, Russian, and French constantly fought over this remote location before being annexed by Norway. But curiously, Svalbard is one of the few territories on Earth where you don't need a visa to enter, as long as your country has ratified the Svalbard Treaty, that is. The Canary Islands off the coast of North Africa are a part of a larger island chain known as Macaronesia, and although currently a part of Spain, their first native inhabitants, as far as we can tell, were the Guanche, an Amazigh or Berber people similar to those found in Morocco or Algeria, and when discovered by the Spaniards, it only took a few generations before the islands were completely subjugated and incorporated by the Spanish. Subsequent migration from the mainland of Spain and intermixing with the native Guanche thoroughly Hispanicized the population, with their language quickly going extinct, although Canary Islanders today do share a certain proportion of their genes with the original people, around 10 to 20% depending on the island. Other islands of Macaronesia, such as Cape Verde, the Azores, and Madeira, were completely uninhabited by the time the Portuguese stumbled upon them, and hence the Portuguese could technically be considered the native inhabitants of all of them, even Cape Verde, which today is mostly made up of mixed-race individuals of West African and European descent, while the current inhabitants of Azores and Madeira are mostly Portuguese with minor African and Canarian ancestry. Other consequences of the colonial age that you might not think of are the plethora of remote, uninhabited islands across the planet that were initially settled by various European powers, some of which have since been abandoned or had their landscape changed entirely by later migration waves. Some of these more exotic locales you may have heard me discuss in the past include the Mascarene Islands in the Indian Ocean, which are usually considered to be a part of the African continent. Lying even further to the west of Madagascar, already a pretty isolated locale, the Mascarene Islands were discovered by Arab sailors and later the Portuguese, but weren't permanently inhabited by a single human soul until the 17th century, when the Dutch set up a short-lived settlement of around 20 years before being abandoned and the vast majority of Dutch settlers evacuated the island. This island of Mauritius, along with the neighboring Réunion and Seychelles, would be later incorporated by the French, who would go on to import a large number of slaves from Madagascar and Africa, and later indentured servants, primarily from southern India and China, completely changing the demographic makeup of these islands, making it hard to believe that Europeans were once the natives of these remote lands. Speaking of Madagascar, this is another interesting case where the modern inhabitants don't exactly resemble the original natives of the islands, as it's believed by most historians and archaeologists that the Austronesians from Southeast Asia were actually the first to permanently inhabit Madagascar, meaning that the original natives of the largest island in Africa were Asians, not Africans. Africans didn't arrive on the island until 1000 AD, when large numbers of Bantus, a part of the larger Bantu expansion, arrived on the western side of the island and quickly began intermixing with the Austronesians, who, along with people from the Middle East and South Asia, completely transformed the population, similar to what occurred in the Melanesian islands of the Pacific. Now, the Austronesians were known as great seafarers, traveling thousands of miles across the oceans, but it was the British who really take the cake in terms of oceanic exploration, having established settlements in almost every single continent, even settling some of the most secluded islands in the world, such as the islands of St. Helena, Ascension, and Tristan da Cunha in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. These islands eventually became a prominent prison colony for the British, having exiled Napoleon Bonaparte and the brother of Shaka Zulu on these islands, along with thousands of Boer prisoners from South Africa, and today is a mix of British, African, Indian, and Chinese ancestry. The island of Bermuda in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean was also completely uninhabited by the time the first English settlers arrived, although most of the population there today is predominantly of African descent. But one of the more interesting was in the 17th century, when a settlement of English Puritans arrived on the completely uninhabited Providence Island in between Colombia and Central America, and brought with them a small number of slaves. Later incorporated into Colombia, the islands today still have a small number of people of English descent, and a large number descended from their slaves, who all speak English, and it's strange to think that they are technically the native inhabitants of these islands. Lastly, and most strangely, is when we look at the world's southernmost continent, and last to ever be explored by humans. And the first person ever born in Antarctica was actually an Argentine man in January of 1978, followed quickly by a Chilean woman in May of that same year. Although technically a Norwegian woman was born on the settlement of Grytviken on the island of South Georgia near Antarctica in 1913, and an Australian man was born on the neighboring Kerguelen Islands in 1858. So who exactly gets to claim to be the natives of Antarctica? We may never know the answer to this question. So I hope this video shows just how arbitrary yet complicated some of these issues are, and how interesting some migration paths around the world can really be. So go ahead and let me know your thoughts on these indigenous peoples, and for today's poll, let me know which group of natives around the world you thought was the most interesting or surprising. And as always, thank you all for watching. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.